I'm going to talk today about gig audiences and sociology. Oh, hello, that's me. I'm Lucy Wood. So just so I know where I'm sort of pitching this, if there are any academics in the audience, if you could like stroke your chin and go, okay, I don't think, maybe you. So I think I probably pitched it about right, like music industry people. So I'll start by talking about my background and what motivated me to do this study, and a bit about how sociologists might explain gig going, and then I'll talk about my methods and what I found out and some sort of thoughts I had based on those. So, I have worked in the music industry for 15 years, primarily in live music. I'm currently a festival booker, but I worked for sort of a long time as a venue promoter. And I've been going to shows for even longer than that. So it's something I really, have cared about for a number of years. I should make a small disclaimer. This is quite a sort of London-centric study. It's where I've mostly worked. It's where I did my research. But I think there should be things that you can kind of apply to your context. I hope so anyway. So I started really getting annoyed by the amount of talking I was seeing at shows. It really, really bothered me. And I think it kind of got to a point where I would go to some shows and I wouldn't be able to hear the band without hearing this sort of hum of talking all the way through the show. And sometimes there would be people talking loudly in my ear the whole way through about, whatever. And it really bothered me. And I started thinking, you've paid £15 or like sort of 25 Aussie dollars at the kind of current exchange rate and up. Like, what is your motivation for being here if you're just going to kind of talk all the way through? And so I decided to apply some formal research to my that question, and I did a master's in sociology. So I don't know. Yeah, apologies if there are any actual sociologists or social scientists in this room if it's a bit patronizing. But so a kind of sociologist generally would see that they're mostly sort of interested in power, and the kind of big subjects in sociology are race, gender, class, wealth inequality, so how one group has a lot of power and they use it to kind of subjugate another group. So for a sociologist of culture, they'd sort of see that there's some power at stake in gig going. There must be some power to be had there. The kind of big theorist in sociology, particularly with regards to culture, is a guy called Pierre Bourdieu, and he was hugely prolific, and he's a whole like 25 keynotes in himself. But he came up with two concepts that are quite useful for thinking about gig going in this context, and they are capitals and habitus. So the idea of sort of social and cultural capital, they work a bit like economic capital. You can earn them, you can use them to kind of better yourself. So for example, with social capital, you could work hard at friendships that then you can kind of get useful things from, like someone who'll put you on a guest list, or, make friends with a doctor who can give you free advice or whatever. And also with kind of cultural capital, you can work at learning lots of interesting things about books and films and whatever, and you're a more interesting dinner party guest, or maybe you'll get one of these very sought after jobs in the creative industries. Like economic capital, that it's sort of rigged, so you inherit both of these things from your parents. Like if your parents have lots of influential friends, you can leverage that for your own advancement. Like you can get an internship, or get into good schools, or that kind of thing. And also your parents might have spent your childhood reading you lots of important books and taking you to art galleries, and that kind of helps kind of reaffirm your position socially as a kind of knowledgeable person. And the other thing about that's similar to economic capital is it's sort of easier to get once you already have it. Like you can kind of build interest on the stores of capital you already have. So if you have a few influential friends, it helps you kind of develop a wider network of other friends through them. So yeah, I guess, but even just having these influential friends and this sort of store of knowledge about culture, you still need to know how to kind of behave when you're around those people. So that's where the second concept, habitus, comes in. it works a bit like, it's a kind of set of dispositions and attitudes and behaviours that your parents will teach you, and then you kind of cultivate with your peers throughout your life and kind of develop. So it's a mode of kind of acting around culture and around people. And you sort of embody it as if it becomes natural, not like it's learned. It's sort of as if it was in you to begin with. And the kind of classic middle class mode of acting around culture is this one of kind of disinterest, a kind of critical, unemotional assessment of form. So in the case of a gig, you might comment on a guitarist's technique or the band being tight. You know, you wouldn't talk passionately about what you felt during that show. You would kind of go, yeah, that third bar in that song was just like, you know, that kind of way of looking at things. And I guess so far so good, and those theories all kind of sound plausible to me as someone who's been to a lot of shows, but they're really missing something, which I'm sure you've all spotted, and that's that they don't really take into account the role of love, and passion. And luckily there are sort of some newer theorists who have been kind of thinking about the role of pleasure, and that's like a guy called Ben-Zakri who did a study of opera fans in Argentina, and an Australian sociologist called Andy Bennett who did a kind of comparison with surfing and how people learn competency with surfing, might also use it in kind of hardcore music scenes, that kind of, not that they're interchangeable, but they learn in similar ways. So both the kind of powery type people and the pleasury type people kind of both stress the role of like the body in experiencing culture, but not much research has really been done by either group and like how that actually works in practice. And so that's what I wanted to try and do. There's one exception really, which is a really brilliant anthropologist called Wendy who was really useful in my study and brilliant. She did a pioneering piece of research on the UK gig scene from about the mid-90s to sort of early 2000s. And the kind of main thing I used in my study was this kind of concept of zones. Within every gig venue, no matter how big or small, there are 3 zones for the audience. The kind of zone 1 at the front is for the often a younger crowd. They're more tightly packed together. They move around a lot more. That's why you might see like moshing, for example. Zone 2 in the middle is a slightly older part of the audience. You know, they might stand sort of very still, silent, sometimes close the eyes, very often with a beer. And then zone 3 at the back is where the music industry personnel stand, and they love to talk. And yeah, so it was really useful for me, but she was sort of lacking something critical in terms of what I was interested in, which is that the last bit of observation she did, I think, was 2003, but and in 2006, this really massive thing happened that's very important, which is the advent of smartphones, which I think really changed everything. So to go back to sociologists, this is Pierre Bourdieu, my man. So the classic ways of studying what people do culture-wise are the survey, where you ask people what they think about a range of different things. And the problem with that is that people tell you what they think you want to know. So I don't know about you guys, but I've definitely ticked boxes where I'm like, yeah, I like jazz. And it's very, sorry, I totally do. I love it, by the way. But yeah, maybe you've done similar things with genres you ought to like. And the other way of studying culture is like the kind of ethnographic field study, where you go into a kind of given space and you observe someone and you note down everything they do for, you know, hours and hours in great detail, which is really terrific if you want to know what that one person did or might do, but not really easy to generalize from and hugely laborious and time consuming. So I needed a method that was going to be able to collect lots of data that I could kind of analyze in a structured way with statistics. So what I did, I devised a method that used a bird watching app. So it's an app that would be used by ornithologists in the field to work out exactly what a bird is, record what a bird is doing at any given time. So there were buttons on it, on my smartphone this was, buttons on it for flaps wings, pecks rival, coos at mate, feeds young, that kind of thing. And I changed it to gig behaviours. I did some piloting to work out what kind of buttons I should program in. I had about 21 different kind of main behaviours. And it was really good because I could observe, someone at a gig and then another person, and kind of generate lots of data really kind of very quickly, the sort of data that I wanted. So these are like some of the, I mean, none of this will surprise you because you've all been to shows and this is what you've seen, but I was kind of doing this for the benefit of my academic, supervisors who may or may not have ever been to a show. And also, it's also useful for us as a sort of record, an unbiased one, because I think if you go to loads and loads and loads of gigs, you only look out for the stuff you want to see, and you only sort of remember the things you want to see. So it kind of helped give something unbiased, a record that we could, look at more objectively. I just made a few little videos to kind of show, the GIFs aren't working. But so to kind of give you a sense of what the 4 main sorts of behaviours were. If this video was playing, you would see a guy kind of like bobbing up and down, pretty much just exactly like that. I think that's the most popular gig behaviour I witnessed. I saw it like 600 times in the 20 hours of observation I did. I'm sorry you can't see the swaying one, but I'm sure you can imagine. Kind of like that. That also is a very popular, 3rd most popular gig behaviour that I saw. The feet don't really come off the floor. It's kind of uncommitted, almost dance. This was an actual dance, but I'm not going to dance for you. That would be really humiliating. Sort of like that, and it was also very popular. And then this is my favourite one. I'm really sorry the video doesn't work, but it's nodding, but it's just this. And you see that loads. It was the 2nd most popular gig behaviour, and from my data, I was able to say that people use nodding as a substitute for dancing because the people who did lots of nodding or lots of dancing didn't do very much of the other one. There were some people who did both, but the extreme nodders were not the extreme dancers and vice versa. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But yeah, so I observed 100 people for about 12 minutes each on average, and I did it covertly, which was totally ethical, I promise you. It actually really was, if anyone from my university research board is here. So I also had asked these people in advance of observing them their age. I could usually tell their gender, and I would ask them what their job was, so I could tell what their social class was. I would wait for 10 minutes till they'd forgotten about me, and then I would sort of stand behind them and observe them. Next, I will present my findings. So the zone thing still happens, like different people do things in different zones. There's some slightly different behaviours in each zone, but it's roughly the same as what Fono found. So the people in zone 1 who are moving around a lot more, obviously think the best way of being at the gig is, to kind of move around. The people who are standing very still privilege this kind of very static technique. And I don't have time to go into or understand properly philosophy and Cartesian duality, but obviously the kind of body and bodily pleasures typically are associated in Western philosophy with being a bit like base and like, average, like often associated with women. They're not as good as like the spiritual pleasures of the mind, and standing still and cerebrally kind of enjoying something. And I think, so I think in theory, standing still, given that we're in this sort of kind of patriarchy, it's the kind of superior way of kind of gaining cultural capital, social capital. That's the kind of the proper way of being at shows, or it is for the dominant group at gigs. Men, because the big difference, some of the biggest differences I found were with regards to gender. So I already said there's nodders and dancers. I guess none of you will be surprised to learn that men nod and women dance, typically. And actually women moved around a lot more than men generally, I think about a third more. And the movements that they did were much more expressive, expansive ones. And it really annoys me that I found this out, actually, but what annoyed me much more was to find out that the big talkers were the women, and the big phone users were the women. Like the most extreme, I think it was twice as much in both cases, twice as much talking and twice as much phone use, and the extreme phone users and talkers were all women. And it might be that that's because it's this sort of wonderful emphasized form of femininity to be more sociable, to talk more, to move around, be expressive, whatever. And the sort of hegemonic masculinity is to be the strong, silent, standing still type. And maybe we're just sort of reproducing, probably we are just sort of reproducing these sort of wider inequalities that exist outside of the gig. But I also was thinking, women can't really earn capital in the way that men can in the gig setting, because the gig scene is basically decided and set by men. The music industry is mostly male, a lot of male artists, a lot more men in the audiences, certainly the shows I went to. Obviously it's changing, it's improving, thank God, but you know, if men are women are sort of sidelined and tokenized effectively in the gig world, and so they may as well enjoy talking and dancing and being on their phone, because standing still isn't going to earn them anything. So that's sort of one possible theory. Age. So I couldn't say a huge amount with regards to age, because the age range of people going to the gigs that I went to was pretty limited. Like the oldest person was 63, and my oldest sort of age group was 35 and up, when I divided my audience into thirds. And the average age of that oldest group is 41, so by no means ancient. But what I found out is that over 35s kind of moved half as much, and they looked around twice as much, which is kind of interesting. And they talked half as much, and surprise, surprise, they used their phones half as much, less than half. So it could be a kind of age effect whereby, I don't know, something about being older makes you more likely to want to look around. Maybe you have a stiff neck, who knows? Or it could be a cohort effect. So when I came of gig age, the cool thing to do at gigs was to stand still, silently staring at the front, and now this sort of younger generation who are coming of age at gigs, it's much cooler to be moving around and whooping and, you know, dancing. Could be one of those things. There were social class differences. It was kind of hard to measure again, because a lot of gigs are basically just middle class people. But if you lopped the kind of poshest people off the top and the sort of lower middle class off the bottom, the very, very middle group, they really talked. They were the ones who talked. And it makes me think of Bourdieu's disinterest again, because how can you express that you're more disinterested than by talking all the way through something? You know and are so familiar with this thing that, you know, you can afford to talk and not listen to it. That's sort of what it feels like to me. Or to kind of put a more positive Benzacrian type spin on it, the way you enjoy music more, and I definitely experienced this myself, is the more you know about it, the more you know, pleasurable it is. So it could be that these guys are sort of talking to each other, and it's building pleasurable anticipation in their bodies, you know, if they're at the gig. It's really hard for me to say, because I couldn't tell if the people I was watching were talking about their shopping list or about, you know, something amazing about the band. But yeah, who knows? The thing that surprised me the most, findings-wise, was that there was really only sort of fractional phone use. So in a 12-minute observation, I think it was 1.7 uses of a phone on average, which is way, way less than you would have been led to believe, given some of the stuff that was in the press a few years ago, and like Bjork and Savages and Arcade Fire and all these really huge artists have told people to, and Prince, you know, to not bring phones to their shows. And I definitely remember it being a bit of a narrative for a while, like people were talking about how annoying it is. And I think possibly the reason I didn't find so much might be a genre thing. Like maybe the shows I went to weren't the big kind of pop spectacles like a Justin Bieber show where you'd want to sort of film the whole thing. Or maybe I would, maybe not you guys. And it might be that it's actually just become less of a popular behavior. So, you know, when it was first being reported on, it was all over the place, and it was really annoying, and people have sort of, I don't know, social norms have caught up with the technology, and now we've learned not to do it. It's possible it's that. And it's also possible it hasn't changed at all, because it only happened 1.7 times on average, but actually it was just a few people using their phones, but for really long periods of time. That's what I saw. So maybe it's so irritating that it just sticks in your mind and becomes a much sort of bigger phenomenon than it actually is. So I guess I didn't see much phone use, you know, visibly in front of me, but I feel like they had a really massive impact on something else that was happening, and that was on talking. And now I should say that I don't really have evidence for this as a kind of actual thing, because I just had a kind of cross-section of what was happening in 2016. If I'd done this study in 2010, maybe I could kind of make a comparison, or 2005, 2005, before phones were even around. But I've got some hunches, and a few other people I've spoken to have similar kind of feelings, and so I've been thinking a bit about what might be kind of happening here. So, you know, so yeah, talking-wise, obviously, Wendy Fonarow would say, well, you've moved back through the zones, that's why you're hearing more talking. You know, now you're in the industry bit where everyone chats. But I spoke to sound engineers who've always stood in the same position in the venue, sort of relative, and they thought it had increased, and I spoke to session musicians who've always sort of stood on the stage, and they also thought it increased. And it might be something to do, I wondered if it was maybe something to do with festivals, so it's ironic that I'm a festival programmer, and I think maybe we've had a negative impact on venue shows. But I think if you're at a festival, you could go and see any one of 15 different amazing bands at any one time. You dip in and out of things. You don't really give it your full attention. You know, it's a more social affair generally. So maybe you're applying that level of concentration in a venue show as well. It's possible. Also, you know, people rely on touring for their income now, largely, and so there's a lot more tours. Like, it's not such a big event. You know, it might have been that there was a band that you might only see once, and you would really shut up and listen to that, whereas now, you know, there are 15 different great shows that you could be seeing, again, sort of similar to the festival effect. So why not talk all the way through? You're going to see this band in another year when they come back to your town. You know, it could just be our general appreciation of music is in a different kind of sphere now. So Jarvis Cocker, the mighty Jarvis Cocker, thought that music has become like a scented candle. It's more like background noise and kind of ambience. It's not something you concentrate on so much. That sort of also seems plausible. There's a really good article by a journalist called David Bennon in The Quietus, who's also really bothered by talking. And in his mind, and this really sort of rings true with me, in a day and age where you can broadcast your thoughts at any time to anyone in the world via social media and, you know, something that you hold in your hand, why wouldn't you talk at shows? You're the center of the universe and everything you have to say is super interesting. You know, so we've become kind of more selfish. There's a kind of confusion between public and private, you know, and I feel like that kind of fits with, I don't know, it's not a very socially scientific thing for me to say. I should be very neutral and objective and just sort of speak based on evidence, but kind of my hunch says it is kind of what's happening. So it's possible that this sort of behavior is going to get worse and worse and worse, or maybe it's already reached its apex and it's going to kind of get better, or maybe there's going to be an entirely new, very irritating behavior that's going to emerge in a few years. I don't know. Yeah, but that is kind of it. But I was hoping that, I mean, I've condensed 2 years of thinking and reading and researching and talking to people into like 25 very brief minutes. So it was a bit of a whirlwind, but I hope that you can take away some of what I've talked about and maybe be looking for the kind of power and pleasure that's at stake in the different shows that you go to, both at the amazing Big Sound, well done Maggie, this is a brilliant event, and also at the gigs that you go to beyond. So thanks very much.